All right, I just wanted to cover a op-ed that was published today in the New York Times by the former chief censor of Twitter, Yoel Roth. Obviously, he ended up being a major figure in the Twitter files, the reporting that was done that proved the US government was relentlessly pressuring and coercing Twitter to censor political views it disliked and to ban people that they regarded as their critics. And it turned out that Yoel Roth was the head of the trust and safety unit that made these decisions, even though he quickly revealed himself in interviews and in writings that had been uncovered to be just a very classic, pretentious, pompous, ideologically charged left liberal, and had obviously been making censorship decisions based on that ideology. And today he has an op-ed in the New York Times, and there you see the headline on the screen, which is "Trump attacked me, then Musk did. It wasn't an accident." And part of this op-ed is designed to lament the fact that he went through a lot of personal turmoil. He had to move his house because of threats. Who knows how serious those threats were, but that's his claim. The much more interesting part of this op-ed, the only reason why I think it's worth mentioning, and I think it is worth mentioning a lot for this reason, is that basically the point he's making is he's trying to warn the public that people are now so angry about the censorship regime, and the public has been persuaded that disinformation experts in this disinformation industry are sufficiently fraudulent that they are now the source, the target of a lot of attacks. These people who are trying to censor the internet in the name of disinformation expertise. And as a result, he says, the progress that they made after the 2016 election in imposing a censorship regime on the internet, ensuring that people they dislike couldn't be heard, is now finally eroding. He's probably overstating the case to which that's true. I hope it's true. I wish it were true. But I do think there's some truth to the fact that this backlash is now finally starting to happen. So let's take a look at what he has to say in this op-ed. Quote, "Private individuals, from academic researchers to employees of tech companies, are increasingly the targets of lawsuits, congressional hearings, and vicious online attacks. These efforts, staged largely by the right, are having their desired effect." Note again this constant equation that goes back to what we were just talking about with Russell Brand, that if you oppose the censorship regime jointly imposed by corporate and state power, it means you're on the right. Polling data does show, we've been over it so many times, that people who identify as Democrats want both big tech and the government to censor the internet in the name of fighting disinformation. He says these attacks are having their desired effect. Universities are cutting back on efforts to quantify abusive and misleading information spreading online. Social media companies are shying away from making the kind of difficult decisions my team did when we intervened against Mr. Trump's lies about the 2020 election. Platforms had finally begun taking these risks seriously only after the 2016 election. Now, I think it's such an important acknowledgement, because that is the historical narrative on which I insist. That it was the 2016 election, the defeat of Hillary Clinton, the election of Donald Trump, it was genuinely traumatic for liberal elites and liberal institutions of power, especially because it was followed or preceded just months earlier by Brexit. And it was after the 2016 election, and because of the 2016 election, that they decided to get serious about censoring the internet, because they realized if people are allowed to speak freely on the internet, that will endanger their power. That is exactly what happened. And I'm glad this op-ed confirms it. He goes on, quote, "Now, faced with the prospect of disproportionate attacks on their employees, companies seem increasingly reluctant to make controversial decisions, letting misinformation and abuse fester in order to avoid provoking public retaliation." You know what? That's exactly what should happen. If you're going to go around imposing a new censorship regime that goes so far as to censor the sitting president of the United States, and thinking that you so reside above ordinary political conflict that you have apprehended objective truth, and can decree what is misinformation and disinformation and what is objective truth, and put your finger on the scale of our political debates and the primary means through which we conduct them, which is the internet, you ought to have that kind of backlash and retaliation. I don't mean violent threats, but I mean a big campaign of anger and subversion and targeting against the people doing this. These are the most fundamental rights we have: the right of free discourse, the right of free debate, the right of free thought. And those who are deliberately threatening them ought to be the target of serious opposition. And I'm glad that they're feeling that, and I'm glad that it's having that desired effect inside these platforms and inside the political culture. He goes on, quote, "When I worked at Twitter, I led the team that placed a fact-checking label on one of Donald Trump's tweets for the first time. Trump's tweet, following the violence of January 6th, I helped make the call to ban his account from Twitter altogether. Nothing prepared me for what would happen next." Really? You censored the sitting president of the United States from the internet, and you didn't expect any blowback from that? The person who was elected by tens of millions of people? Quote, "Backed by fans on social media, Mr. Trump publicly attacked me." You banned him from the internet. 2 years later, following his acquisition of Twitter, and after I resigned my role as the company's head of trust and safety, Elon Musk added fuel to the fire. I've lived with armed guards outside my home and have had to upend my family, go into hiding for months, and repeatedly move. Now, as I said, I don't think if he's actually gotten credible threats of violence, that's justified. But everything short of that is. He says, quote, "This isn't a story I relish revisiting, but I've learned that what happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't just personal vindictiveness or cancel culture. It was a strategy, one that affects not just targeted individuals like me, but all of us, as it is rapidly changing what we see online. These attacks on internet safety and security come at a moment when the stakes for democracy could not be higher." Listen to why he's so concerned that free speech is starting to thrive again on the internet. Quote, "More than 40 major elections are scheduled to take place in 2024, including in the United States, the European Union, India, Ghana, and Mexico. These democracies will most likely face the same risk of government-backed disinformation campaigns and online incitement of violence that have plagued social media for years. We should be worried about what happens next." Now, when we recently reported on the study by the EU, which purported to show that there was all sorts of disinformation being permitted online, particularly on Twitter, that they weren't censoring enough, there they also explicitly said their main concern was the coming elections. They wanted more censorship explicitly because they were concerned about how free speech might result in outcomes that they couldn't control. And that is precisely what this is really about, is the idea that if there's too much free speech on the internet, they can no longer control how people think, and they will therefore lose power, as they did with Brexit, as they did with Trump's victory, and with so many other things, until they started clamping down. And what he's saying is the backlash against this, including a recent court decision holding that the Biden administration's pressure on big tech was a violation of the First Amendment, one of the gravest and most systemic in years, is starting to undermine and erode their ability to maintain the censorship regime. And for that, we ought to be celebratory. Let me just show you the last part of this article. Quote, "One of the most recent forces in this campaign is the Twitter files, a large assortment of company documents, many of them sent or received by me during my nearly 8 years at Twitter, turned over at Mr. Musk's discretion to a handful of selected writers. The files were hyped by Mr. Musk as a groundbreaking form of transparency, purportedly exposing for the first time the way Twitter's coastal liberal bias stifles conservative content. What they delivered was something else entirely. As tech journalist Mike Mancic put it, Mike Mancic, one of the worst, most dishonest liberals in media, who constantly defends big tech. As tech journalist Mike Mancic put it, after all the fanfare surrounding the initial release of the Twitter files, in the end, quote, there was absolutely nothing of interest in the documents. And what little there was had significant factual errors. Now, the people who spent all that time claiming that have to be a little bit embarrassed about the fact that the revelations of those Twitter files, the topic that they covered, the pressure campaign emanating from the US government to big tech, was just ruled to be one of the worst violations of the First Amendment in decades. In fact, the district court judge said it may be a type of censorship campaign, the likes of which the judiciary had never seen before. That is what Yoel Roth is trying to say, citing Mike Mansick and all those other corporate journalists who called it a nothing burger, is something that you should ignore. Now, just to conclude, what he says here, quote, facing seven-figure legal bills, even some of the largest and best-funded university labs have said they may have to abandon ship. Others targeted have elected to change their research focus based on the volume of harassment. Bit by bit, hearing by hearing, these campaigns are systematically eroding hard-won improvements in the safety and integrity of online platforms, with the individuals doing this work bearing the most direct cost. Tech platforms are retreating from their efforts to protect election security and slow the spread of online disinformation. Amid a broader climate of belt-tightening, companies have pulled back especially hard on their trust and safety efforts. As they face mounting pressure from the hostile Congress, these choices are as rational as they are dangerous. I mean, I'm always amazed by the embedded presumption that these people are qualified to decree what is disinformation and to censor our political speech accordingly. But what he is saying is that there is now enough political pressure, enough backlash on the part of the public, enough anger that these institutions are finally starting to feel intimidated and like it's not worth the cost to continue to censor. I'm not nearly as optimistic. He sees that as something that is a tragedy. I see it as a cause for celebration, but I'm not nearly as convinced it's to the level that he thinks it's at. But I absolutely do believe that this tide is turning, because inculcated within all of us is the value system that only despots censor political speech. And it's gotten so extreme. I think the attempt to actually censor the sitting president of the United States, which provoked anger and concern all over the world, including from leaders like Germany's Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron and the president of Mexico and various UN officials who never liked Trump, was such an overstep. And the ongoing campaigns to just continuously insist that the internet can only be safe if it's controlled by them is starting to become so offensive and facially dangerous that I do think this sort of retaliation is going to start to happen. That is one of the major reasons we focus on it so much on the show. I want people who give themselves the title of disinformation expert to immediately be recognized as what they are, which is con men and frauds, so that nobody takes these pronouncements seriously and everyone understands what they really are, which are thinly disguised efforts to render political censorship of the most classic and brute form some sort of elevated, data-driven science. That is the fraud that has been perpetrated for a long time. It absolutely came from the conclusion of the liberal elite in the West that free speech was too dangerous to permit on the internet. Go ahead and call this right wing if you want. I really don't care. I'm going to continue to make this a primary cause of mine because a free internet was the cause of the Snowden reporting. It absolutely is one of the greatest tools we have to be able to communicate without the control of these maniacs who really are so enamored of their own political convictions that they will do anything to impose it on others. They've given up on the idea of persuading. And it is somewhat encouraging to see this cause getting more attention, to see it be the subject of this Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that is almost certainly headed to the Supreme Court. The Biden administration has appealed the ruling. There you see it on the screen. We've covered this at length. This is going to the Supreme Court. We'll see what ends up happening. But whatever else is true, the rage that is now building against the institutions that have been agitating for censorship, led by Democrats in Congress, the FBI, the Biden White House, and especially the corporate media is getting more and more intense. And as far as I'm concerned, that should continue with no end in sight. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.